Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Thomas Keating's talk on how to communicate over 100,000 years, nuclear memory and the management of the future. My name is Serena Zhou, and I am an eco-critic and currently the chair of Farm for Change, Climate Eco-Poetics and Earth Justice, an interdisciplinary research lab of the Institute of European American Studies, Academia Sinica, Taiwan. Our research lab is dedicated to the study of environmental literature and resilient society. It is with great pleasure that we have Dr. Thomas Keating and Professor Chen Chun-Yen with us today. Dr. Thomas Keating, our speaker, is a postdoctoral researcher working at the intersection of cultural geography and human technology relationships. Since 2021, he has held the position of postdoctoral researcher in technology and social science at Linköping University. Dr. Keating holds a PhD in human geography from the University of Bristol and has held academic position at UNSW Canberra School of Sciences in Australia, Swansea University, UK, the European School of Brussels, Belgium, and the University of Bristol. His research consistently engages with the pressing issue arising from the interplay between humans and technology. Keating's recent publication include articles on nuclear memory in journals such as Progress Environmental Geography, Geophilosophies in Subjectivity, and Technogenesis in Progress in Human Geography. He also co-edited the collection Speculative Geographies, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Currently, Keating is the lead investigator alongside Professor Anna Storm on a project exploring the speculative problem of how to communicate the memory of nuclear waste repositories in Sweden 100,000 years into the future. This research involves the development of a key information file to ensure the longevity and accuracy of such critical information, a topic that informed his talk today. Part of his work takes place within the Nuclear Energy Agency expert group on awareness preservation, of which he has been a member since 2021. And Professor Chen Chun-Yen, our respondent today, received her PhD in comparative literature from Cornell University and is currently a full professor in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at National Taiwan University. Her fields of specialization include critical theory, media theory, contemporary Anglophone literature, and post-colonial studies. Her current research project concerns the turn to immediacy in contemporary literary, cultural, and philosophical spheres, that is, a privileging of a mediated or direct experience in contemporary literary practices, cultural narratives, and critical thought. She came across Dr. Keating's work when she was preparing for a graduate seminar she's teaching this summer, just now, titled Media Studies on Time. So let's welcome Professor Dr. Keating and also Professor Chen, and we'll give the floor to Thomas.
Thank you for such a warm and really hospitable introduction. I'm really delighted to be here, and I think being actually learning a little bit more about Farm for Change, I can see there's a really exciting and real diverse set of talks you've been hosting for a number of years now, and including a couple more talks in November and December, which I'm going to keep an eye on. It's really a diverse and interesting set of research conversations that you're bringing together here, and I'm really honoured and happy to be here today. So I want to thank you, Serena, and Professor Chen Chun-Yen for the chance to speak, and also to, I guess, gain a bit of your insights, hopefully, in the second half of this 2-hour session. So there's an hour for me to speak now, and then I think we'll have some time for hopefully some input and for me to gain a bit of your insight into some of these themes. So the topic today is really on this question of communication, of memory, and actually how it relates to nuclear waste and its management over deep future time horizons. And I guess one of the things that I really want to emphasize is actually right from the off is that, well, this is a really nascent, interesting, I think, an important area of research. It's something, in many ways, it's still in its infancy. There's things that are not fully developed and need actually more international research, which I would encourage you to invest in if you're interested in these themes. And it also is something, and I guess my key message today is that to communicate a message over 100,000 years is clearly no easy feat, to say the very least. And it does require genuinely interdisciplinary methods and techniques and knowledge from across the social sciences and sciences. So I think this is genuinely an area of research where, there is no doubt that the expertise of people in the social sciences and the arts and humanities too have so much to offer, scientific inputs and insights, which too often drive these conversations. So there's kind of three elements of this talk I want to focus on. The first is just to give a context. Can I just check something actually? Can you see the full slide, or is my kind of WebEx camera?
Yes, we can see the full slide, and
it
seems to be
not
running.
cutting off.
Yeah.
Super. Okay, so so I'm going to give a kind of context to the project, and that's really about the kind of writing of the key information file for a Swedish repository for highly radioactive spent nuclear fuel. And I'm going to give a kind of sense of what it's been about and how this project has come together. I also want to give you a kind of insight into the problem of what myself and my colleague Anna Storm have termed nuclear memory, which concerns this question of communicating over 100 millennia. And third and kind of finally, and I guess as a way of conclusion actually, is to give you a sense of the key information file as one technique for managing deep future nuclear waste futures. So the key information file is really what we've been focusing on doing over the last few years, and is really our answer to some of these questions about how to warn the future of nuclear waste. But to give you the context, so this has been really a 3-year project, which is ending this year, and actually will end slightly later than September due to some extra funding. It's a project led by myself and Anna Storm of Linköping University, which is in Sweden. Linköping is kind of halfway between Stockholm and Gothenburg, in the kind of south of the country. And the project was commissioned by the Swedish Nuclear Fuel and Waste Management Company, SKB. SKB are effectively an arm of kind of government management. They receive a percentage of all the profits from nuclear energy that's been produced, about a third of that, or at least a significant chunk of that profit has gone into this kind of nuclear waste fund, which has all been about gathering money for the future to ensure we can manage these toxic leftovers of nuclear energy production. And so the SKB is formed really as a kind of to draw on that fund of money and to provide solutions to manage nuclear waste. So they're the ones who actually financed and asked for this project to be done, and it had 2 main aims. So the first was to develop methods and writing for a key information file, which I'll give you a sense of what that is. And it contributes to this kind of question of nuclear memory, or what they term memory communication of Sweden's permanent geological repository for nuclear waste. And the second is to carry out independent research, and this is what I'll also present in this talk, laying a meta perspective on the societal processes that characterize permanent nuclear waste repositories. And this is one thing that really attracted me to this project in the first place, was this idea that it combined the technical and the existential. So what that means is it, and I think this is a really wonderful articulation, I didn't come up with it, but I think it's a really good one, because it's about the fact that this, when it comes to nuclear waste and its management into the future, you've got this kind of commingling of a very practical, necessary problem of materials that can cause death to all organic life, but also this very existential problem, and what I would term a speculative problem, which is actually, how do we communicate over such a long period of time? And what kind of challenges arise in that kind of endeavor? So there are all kinds of power hierarchies and questions of time and temporality in the future that come into this very practical question of managing nuclear waste, and particularly managing the information about it. But to give you the full context, so this map shows you very kind of simply two places in Sweden, obviously in Northern Europe. Stockholm is the capital, you can see marked there, and around 150 kilometers north of Stockholm is a small village called Forsmark. Forsmark is the location of the planned nuclear waste repository for highly radioactive spent nuclear fuel. And this is a kind of image of what will eventually be built in Forsmark. So for those unfamiliar with the Swedish plans, which I imagine almost everybody is, although I'm interested here for those who might not have heard of some of these things before. So the work concerns the building of a very specific kind of repository. And repository is, I guess, a placeholder, another word for burial site, effectively. And this is what they term, in Sweden, a permanent geological repository for nuclear waste. It was also termed at one point a final repository. And these are the kind of different kind of semiotic, different ways of describing the same technological solution to nuclear waste, effectively. So what we're talking about, and I should be clear that there are different types of repositories for different kinds of nuclear waste. So this is specifically about highly radioactive, long-lived nuclear waste, which is spent fuel. And what that means is we're referring to really the leftovers from nuclear energy production, particularly this spent uranium, and particularly, which often occurs in these kind of like small pellets. And these pellets of uranium, which have been undergone a fission reaction, are more radioactive than any other form of nuclear waste, precisely because their half-lives are the longest. It requires the longest amount of time for them to return to pre-fission levels of radioactivity. And they also emanate and kind of cause the most strongest amount of radioactive wave exposure. So this is considered the kind of most serious nuclear waste. And often this kind of language of whether it's termed nuclear waste or spent fuel is very debatable. And there's often a kind of industry term is to describe it as spent fuel because it sounds slightly less threatening. But ostensibly what we're talking about is the most radioactive materials on Earth. And Sweden devised this idea of burying the waste in what they call a permanent repository. And what that means is it's an idea of developing a repository where you put the waste inside and you lock it up and throw away the key. And only 2 nations on Earth have committed to this kind of plan, and that is Sweden and Finland. And so just to give you the full story. So the final repository for nuclear waste in Sweden was approved in January 2022, which was around a year after I started working on this project. So I actually began working on this project for SKB before they even had full kind of approval from the Swedish government that this idea would go ahead. It's the outcome of many decades of planning and investment and research by SKB, but also other agencies in Sweden. And what it concerns is really is how spent fuel will be sealed within these small kind of tunnels, which will be built and dug underground in Forsmark, which is just, as you can see from the image in the background, is actually a coastal village. It's obviously more northern, further north than Stockholm, so it's on the side of Sweden, closer to Finland. The waste that will be buried there will travel by boat, by ferry actually, from Barsebäck and other nuclear energy plants down the coast. And it's premised on a particular kind of technology, which is called KBS3. KBS3 technology, which I'll give you an image of later, is the process of putting spent fuel pellets inside of copper canisters, which, well, actually they're inside kind of fuel rods, which then get inserted in copper canister, filled with concrete, and then backfilled with bentonite clay. Bentonite clay is actually the same material often used in cat litter trays. It's very absorbent, it's very good at absorbing water and stopping water from corroding the copper. So the copper canister is the idea that you can completely seal off the waste within a kind of non-permeable material. And the idea with the clay and the concrete is just to really try to prevent any water being exposed to these underground waste canisters through time. It's non-retrievable, and what non-retrievable means is that there is no technological solution currently. Well, this whole design is based on this lock it up and throw away the key. There's not an option to bring the waste up to the surface again easily. So the idea is it's really meant to stay there indefinitely. And so there's no kind of easy way of bringing the waste back up to the surface once it's been buried. And it's based on what the industry, SKB and others, term the principle of, quote, passive safety, which means that there is planned to be no human monitoring of the waste site through time. So what that means is that at some point in the future, once this site has been fully excavated and filled with waste, there'll be a kind of complete cut in any human activity of the site. And what that means is that there'll be no data gathered, supposedly. There'll be no active human safeguarding. The idea is that all humans would be able to remove themselves from the site, and that this waste facility would look after itself, that it'd be kind of fully autonomous and passive in the way that it protects the waste. And the reason that's such an important principle of this whole plan in Sweden and Finland is that because, of course, if you didn't have passive safety, if it was active monitoring by humans through time, then the cost of this would be unthinkable. The actual cost of paying for people to be safeguarding this waste would make the cost of this energy dwarf anything close to any other renewable energy that's been suggested today as expensive. So this waste facility, so the actual environmental licenses for this site have been approved. The drilling has not begun yet, and actually the full excavation of the site and also the kind of filling of the waste and the sealing of the site won't be completed until the turn of the 22nd century. So over 100 years for this to, around 100 years for this to be completed. I should mention that Finland approved their nuclear waste repository, the exact same technology borrowed from Sweden. They approved theirs earlier, so they began actually filling their nuclear waste repository. Actually, I think it's this year, so I think it's actually going to be in the next month or so, and they're going to start putting waste into what's called Onkolu, which is the Finnish nuclear waste site on Onkoliko Island, which is Finnish for hiding place. So, in coming up with this plan, Sweden and Finland too have created a particular kind of problem, and a very unique problem, which demands some kind of solution, which is how do we warn the future of the existence of nuclear waste buried underground? And one thing I should have said actually already is that the whole plan, the official plan devised by SKB, so the Swedish Nuclear Fuel and Waste Management Company, is that this site that they've devised must last 100,000 years. So that's a time horizon that they specifically define. Other countries have got other plans which are at different stages. Germany, for example, have begun the site selection process for their own nuclear waste repository, premised on the time horizon of 1 million years. So actually, the idea of 100,000 or 1 million years, it's actually quite a huge distinction. We're actually talking about very similar materials. But the whole idea, I guess, is that after 100,000 years, the nuclear waste, the spent fuel, would return to something resembling pre-fission levels of radioactivity. So that means it would return to a level of radioactivity that's deemed safe, or at least deemed safe enough to not require any management. But of course, the question is that when you create a final repository, how do you stop, or how do you make sure that information about this is transmitted through time? So whilst the technical challenges of spent fuel storage have been engaged by the scientists for many decades, and SKB have been doing kind of borehole drilling, composite research, corrosion tests on copper canisters, lots of different kind of scientific experiments underground since the kind of 80s and 90s. The societal challenges of communicating the existence of the buried waste to the future has been really treated as quite marginal in terms of importance. And that's quite surprising in lots of ways, particularly thinking about the way that much of the necessary scientific testing is about the safety, ensuring the safety case, ensuring the safety of nuclear waste repositories. But for some reason, the idea that the information transfer about the site and the societal memory of that site is also connected to safety is quite a surprising one. And I think actually a lot of industries are waking up to this idea that actually this really does need to be treated as quite a significant problem that requires investment and capacity. And we can think of examples, actually throw lots of different, you'll get a lot of examples today from me, hopefully that you find interesting, but the idea of communicating a message through time was also countenanced by Carl Sagan, famously, kind of TV physicist and astronomer in the US in 1977. Famously added a small archive to the Voyager satellite that was sent into space, which is still traveling thousands of kilometers away from the Earth to this day. And inside created this archive, this message to not just the future, but also to alien species about what they need to know about the human race and what they should know about the Earth, if any other thinking sentient life form was ever to discover this satellite. And inside of it, he put this golden record, famously, and a golden record player that you'd be able to listen to music and voice recordings describing different elements of human life, including artworks and different things. So there is actually examples in human culture and life of people trying to send a message to last across millennia, and even the idea of communicating with something after the human has already been premised that actually is of relevance to this question. And I should say that the reflections and ideas that I'm drawing on draw on kind of around 30-40 hours of interviews with experts in nuclear waste management, my own role as part of the Nuclear Energy Agency expert group for awareness preservation. So it's a small expert group who were just dealing with this problem of information and knowledge and archival transfer through time about nuclear waste repositories. There's 2 publications here that Anna and I have written so far on this project, and there's a few others in the pipeline. Particularly this nuclear memory paper in Progress in Environmental Geography is some of what I'm talking about is drawn from this, but also a more recent public-facing piece in the conversation, which is available open access online if you'd like to read them. So I wanted just to give you a sense of the problem of nuclear memory, and this is really just a kind of quick summary because not wanting to speak for too long and eat into the time for discussion. But there are a few examples of messages being communicated over a few thousand years. So we can think of things like tsunami stones in Japan, actually other places in Southeast Asia too, which have done the work of communicating the existence of what to do in an event of a tsunami, what to do in an event where the tide or the sea level is suddenly much lower. So these kind of messages of warning of what people should do, the idea of going to higher land, the idea of danger and communicating some kind of warning through time Tsunami stones are around 600 years old, so obviously much smaller time horizon than 100,000 years. We can think of things like burial sites and human remains, which are very classic and very important example of information and signs being communicated through human history, particularly Egyptian remains, which actually some of which are thousands of years old. Increasingly, these projects have become fascinated by mythologies and stories, which actually I know some people in Farm for Change in this seminar series have spoke about kind of eco-mythologies and eco-stories, which are a big part of environmental humanity research today. So you can think of things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is approximately 4,000 years old. And I've recently discovered this, a paper in the journal Science, which used a different kind of carbon dating to actually more accurately date this kind of image you can see on the right here of a cave painting in northern Spain. It's actually twice as old as they realized. It's 64,000 years old, this image. So again, a really incredibly long time horizon, really. And actually, you can see from the image it's actually a person climbing some kind of ladder. There's some kind of animal depicted in there. But clearly, there's a lot of mystery around this image too. And actually, its informational content is relatively obscured. It's not totally clear from the image what it is that we're meant to understand or glean from this message. So the idea of a cave painting as performing a kind of nuclear warning sign still leaves many questions to be answered. And so the key point I want to make clear is, in most cases of thinking about messages being communicated for the longest possible time in human history, the message is either no longer understandable, no longer deemed relevant, or deliberately or even accidentally ignored or misinterpreted. So returning to the Egyptian sarcophagus examples, actually a lot of the time hieroglyphics were either read things like danger, do not enter this tomb, do not enter this sarcophagus. And a lot of the time the message was either misinterpreted and they entered it thinking that the message said something else, or it was interpreted correctly, but the kind of element of human curiosity and human intrigue and necessity, or even just the idea that there could be something valuable inside the tomb, was enough to make the person reading the message disobey its intent. So this is a really important idea within nuclear memory research. And by nuclear memory, I'm really referring, myself and Anna refer to a vast swathe of different techniques for communicating the existence of nuclear waste and nuclear materials through time. And that's really occurred in the last since the 1970s. This area of research has become more and more important and drawn on these cases that I'm mentioning now. And there's lots of others, of course, so many others that we could be discussing. But I want to give you the sense of the stakes, thinking especially in kind of the social sciences and what people are trying to do to understand this problem and challenge of communicating nuclear materials through time, or what we term nuclear memory communication. And there are many, and these two books on the screen now, one by Rosemary Joyce, The Future of Nuclear Waste, and the other by who's an anthropologist based at Berkeley, and this other book, Vincent Iolenti's Deep Time Reckoning, have been very important sources of inspiration in our project for myself and Anna. So we can think of different challenges here, and one is the way that actually a lot of the official plans for burying nuclear waste revolves around this process of modelling risk and calculating risk. So trying to imagine different future scenarios, different threats, different contingencies that might cause the nuclear waste that's been buried to be exposed or to be differently endangered by environmental or human processes and actions. Most often, the risk modelers point to the biggest threat to nuclear waste repositories being human-based. So war and accidental digging, things like that, are seen as much more threatening to geological repositories for nuclear waste. than things like an ice age. I mean, actually, one thing that's really interesting in speaking to the experts preparing these plans in Sweden and Finland and elsewhere in Europe has been that, you know, so much of them they're so excited about the ice age. They're really excited for this, the coming ice age in the next few millennia, because the ice age in northern Europe would allow for this, you know, the whole surface of the repository to be covered and you know, it would make it harder for humans to access it. So this idea that the ice age is this kind of brilliant thing that will come and protect this waste, which obviously flies in the face of, you know, other human imaginations about what the ice age would do to society. The next challenge is really things like expert groups, and this is what Joyce does so well to identify in her book, that the cultures of knowledge and even the kind of common sense thinking that permeates nuclear waste management plans, the way they think about the future, it's often they imagine the future as really just an extrapolation of the present. So the future will resemble what we have today in a really kind of, you know, extrapolative sense. And it's really hard for nuclear experts and people planning for the future of nuclear waste repositories to imagine a future that's radically different to today. And to give one example I've noticed really in who I've dealt with is, you know, thinking about things like technological progress. Very few experts are willing to admit the idea that in the future, perhaps society will have less technological sophistication. Perhaps the technologies that the future use will be less sophisticated than today. That idea is completely rejected as impossible, or nearly impossible, by a lot of experts. And that's one example of a kind of common sense thinking that's quite hard to permeate and break through. There's also been a lot of emphasis on what role the non-human will have in actively collaborating and communicating and safeguarding nuclear waste. I mean, Anna's wrote a little bit on this too, on the idea that once the waste is placed in the earth, the bedrock, the granite stone that surrounds the nuclear waste repository is seen as a kind of permeable, permanent carer of the waste. And in what ways can non-human things also be incorporated into the way that we warn the future and think about and communicate information through time? That's something I'm going to discuss in just a moment. And we can also think about things like nuclear markers. And actually, this is really what Peter Van Wyck's book on warning signs really delves into, is what kinds of semiotic tools, artistic tools, signs, language, forms of communication are suitable for communicating over 100,000 years. So there are lots of different proposals we can think about, and actually what are the solutions to these challenges that people have come up with so far. Probably the most famous example is this one. Actually, it's two different images. One's the landscape of thorns on the right, and the left is Spike Field, which is the both concept developed by Michael Brill and Zafar Abidi, Michael was an architect, and Safdar was an artist who came up with these concepts. And this was part of actually a much wider effort in the late 1980s and early 1990s in the United States as part of the WIP project, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, which was the United States' effort to come up with their own plan for a nuclear waste repository and their kind of test site in New Mexico in the United States. And as part of this effort, I mean, actually a lot of these plans in the United States have actually really fallen by the wayside, especially since really the Obama administration, who finally kind of put an end to the effort to make Yucca Mountain a waste repository for a site for nuclear waste repository. And there was lots of reasons for that. It was an incredibly expensive process. And what they did in the late 80s and early 1990s in the US, when they really wanted to think about this problem and plan for it, which was really, they put together a series of events and formed these task groups. And to make these task groups, they pulled together not just physicists and nuclear experts, but actually experts from all different swathes of human knowledge and thinking. So astronomers were brought in, they brought in artists and architects, of course, they brought in anthropologists, sociologists, even people who study kind of animal ethology and human relations. So they really tried to gather this kind of motley crew of genuinely interdisciplinary research grouping. And they assembled them into two teams, Team A and Team B, and they asked them to go away and come up with lots of different proposals for how you would warn the future about the nuclear waste being buried, at the time was planned to be buried in the US. And they came up with loads of different examples, and it's actually a really brilliant report that you can find online where you can sift through some of these. And one of the most kind of striking visually was this landscape of thorns and spike field, which is the idea that you could create not just warning signs in a kind of literal sense, stop, warning as a kind of metal sign, but actually make an environmental whole landscape of different signs. So actually this idea that you can make spikes on the surface above a nuclear waste repository, create a kind of whole environment that feels very inhospitable, that somebody would walk into this space and feel threatened or feel there was some kind of element of danger. So it's really drawing in these kind of affective cues, these kind of processes of affect and mood and atmosphere that would create a vibe for a human walking in this place to even if they didn't know anything about the nuclear waste, would get the sense from the environment that something was wrong. And in creating these proposals, the experts in these two the experts in these two groups also came up with lots of different symbology and semiotic signs. So this example here is of a kind of surface marker. So this warning sign that somebody would find if they came across the entrance to a nuclear waste repository. So it reads danger, poisonous, radioactive, waste buried here, do not dig or drill here before 12,000 AD. And 12,000 AD refers to the time horizon for the American nuclear repository, which was actually only 10,000 years. So I mentioned before that in Germany, they have a time horizon of 1 million years. In Sweden and Finland, it's 100,000 years. And in the US, it was 10,000 years. So you can already see, completely different scales of time and time horizons being incorporated into the same official plans for managing spent nuclear fuel. And this warning sign drew on kind of two things. The first was Edvard Munch's The Scream, which experts deemed to be a kind of universal image of fear, of this idea that, we need a universal sign that anybody in the future would be able to understand. Part of this, the whole premise of nuclear memory communication, the problem is that, over 100,000 years, you can't guarantee that that human language today will be relevant. The whole problem that we're facing with this is that the human, all our signs, all language today, and even our kind of representative signs, things like danger, stop signs, radioactive symbology, we can't guarantee in the future that these signs will be effectual over 100,000 years. So what they were doing is trying to find an image that would potentially be universal, that would last forever. And they drew on Munch's The Scream, but also this taxonomy of facial expressions that they drew from an ethological expert whose book I got the reference to at the end, if you'd like to read it. And they came up with this idea of this kind of pain, nauseated, but also kind of upset face, physically hurt and tormented face that they could bring together as a kind of symbol for the future. But one thing I wanted to mention about this is that, this is really, there's no guarantees that these kinds of images work. And of course, even looking at this taxonomy of faces, you can see it's premised on a particular there's a kind of Eurocentrism to these kind of facial types. There's a lot of, obviously there's a heteronormativity to them too. The idea that there's a kind of male figure that's dominating this universal image of the face. And there's also this sense, and this is one of the things I found most interesting, if you look through the report, which you can see the reference to on this screen, the Appendix F Team A report. So this is one groupings report. They spent a lot of time discussing, whether we could use human remains, so skulls and crossbones, because in human history, skulls have been used as a kind of symbol of death, a symbol of danger. This idea that the human skull, could give you this kind of universal figure for danger and deterrence, for warning the future about nuclear waste repositories. However, one person in the team pointed out that actually, in places like Mexico, the skull is actually considered as a symbol for life and vitality and renewal. So actually, even in kind of human culture today, we can see that things that are seemingly obviously danger or symbols of deterrence have a geography and a kind of spatiality to them. So it opens up a new kind of thought and reflection about actually what kinds of symbology and symbols and signs might work, and over what time frame are they suitable for communicating messages. So the challenges are clearly vast, and since the kind of early 90s, there's been an effort to build on this existing research and to develop new approaches, and lots of different kind of areas for what we term nuclear memory communication. One example here is the Blue Zone by two artists, Stéphane Perrault and Aram Kebadajji. And these two artists actually developed this idea of a genetically modified forest. So the idea that you could genetically modify plants to glow in the dark, and this forest would be planted all across the area of a nuclear waste repository and be used as a kind of sign of kind of something unusual going on. So kind of drawing on the same logic of the landscape of thorns, but developing and building on kind of newer technologies of genetic modification and bioengineering to create this kind of national park, this kind of areas of significance, where in the future you might not know that there's nuclear waste buried underneath, but you would know that something unusual was defined a certain area, and you could detect this kind of an area of significance through these unusual plants that would glow. This idea of semiotics and landscape art has also been folded into more recent proposals. This by German artist Joris Wegner, who came up with this proposal for durable glass materials. So these are kind of another kind of landscape marker, but also that would be placed across a whole national area. So the idea is that across the site where a nuclear waste repository was buried, you would find these kind of glass objects, and inside the objects you would find a human skull, and inside the kind of glass surrounding the skull, you would find these symbols of deterrence. So then, obviously, the radioactive sign, the human kind of escape emergency sign. So drawing on contemporary symbology and ideas of kind of danger and warning that exist today. So the idea that glass is this kind of durable material can be one kind of non-human carrier of information and archives through time. And even more recently than this, there have been kind of more than artistic proposals for things like cults and religious groups. So this idea of the atomic priesthood, which was first kind of proposed by the Italian semiotics expert Thomas Sibok, who famously wrote about this idea of creating a kind of atomic priesthood around the nuclear waste. And the idea here would be that the safest way to carry messages through time is actually religion, and religion creates this kind of permanence that other kinds of artistic forms of expression can't achieve. So the idea is you create this kind of bloodline, this kind of cultish group of atomic priests whose only purpose is to retain the message and the knowledge of the nuclear waste repository, and they would carry this through time. And this idea was taken up by Brian McGovern-Wilson and Robert Williams in their project running until 2018. And Seabuck also famously came up with this proposal, and this was kind of half jokingly, but it's actually had a surprising interest and lifespan of the atomic ray cats. So the atomic ray cats, I mean, a bit like the genetically modified forest, the idea that you would genetically modify cats to glow in the dark, and these cats would roam around the kind of landscape where a nuclear waste repository was buried, and you could create this kind of zone of these kind of unusual glowing animals that you could let free and would indirectly communicate the message of kind of radioactivity and the presence of radioactive materials lying underground. If you're interested in the atomic ray cats, you can actually buy t-shirts and memorabilia. It's become quite a big internet trend, it seems. There is even, I think there's a music group named after the atomic ray cats. And there's a whole kind of life of atomic ray cats that exists online that you can follow up with if you're interested in this. So at this point, I wanted to introduce the key information file, and actually how have myself and my colleague Anna, how have we approached many of these themes and tried to address the problem of nuclear memory communication. And we should say, first of all, that the key information file is not our idea. It draws on this existing report, this Nuclear Energy Agency, NEA report from 2019 that you can see on the left, which is RKNM, which is the shorthand for it. And this report, really conceptualizes the idea of the key information file and what it is. So to give you a full sense, the key information file, or KIF, K-I-F, is the top of this pyramid here you can see on the screen. And it's meant to be a summary document, so around 40 pages long. And the idea is that KIF is the kind of most succinct, precise, and kind of, lowest level of detail, but also the most kind of permanent and most accessible document. So the idea is this would be a kind of really short summary, literally acting as a key to other information and archives that could be found elsewhere. And as you travel down the pyramid, you can see other forms of information. These other forms of information are increasingly wide, so increasingly large in volume, but also increasingly hard to access. So the second level of the pyramid is the SER, which is the set of essential records. And this would be a much wider archive located in some kind of national archives, is the kind of idea, where you'd be able to find a much wider range of technical reports, much more technical information about the key information about the nuclear waste repository, much wider information about government decisions, about why these processes were approved in the first place. As you move further and further down the pyramid, you get these much wider kind of regulatory information, and even things like boreholes and physical like material archives of rock and soil. So the key information file is premised on this sense that it's a very short document that should be open to a non-expert audience. And that's a really important part of this. The key information file is meant to be accessed by the widest possible audience, and it should be understandable by somebody who has no prior information about nuclear waste or nuclear energy. So it's not meant for experts, it's meant for public readers, and it's meant to be, really, it's premised on this sense of, in the future, we may forget, or we may actually lose information about the nuclear waste repository. So what we do, and so the key information file, like these other forms of artistic expression, would be a way of ensuring that information was kept alive about the nuclear waste repository, particularly in the event of sudden information loss. And just to give you a sense of this, I just want to mention one thing that probably I should have said before about these proposals, thinking about the artistic proposals here, is, at the end of this kind of report and these proposals in the early 90s about how to manage nuclear waste through time, a lot of the experts concluded that it was, it's too hard to create a universal image, and actually it was impossible to create a sign that would last for 100,000 years. And so some of them actually advocated and supported the idea that society should just forget the nuclear waste was buried there, and the safest thing to do is for humans not to know about it anymore and forget its existence. And that would be the safest way, because you would ensure that people wouldn't accidentally go into the site or do it intentionally because they want to get the copper canisters and retrieve this valuable metal. But the problem with that proposal, forgetting the existence of a nuclear waste repository as a kind of principle of safety is, how do societies remember to forget? How do we actively remember to forget the existence of something? How do you plan at an institutional level to actively forget? And how do you ensure that forgetting is done across the globe by everybody? Because it only works if everybody forgets. So this is the kind of the conundrum that these expert groups got themselves into. And that's why today, the Nuclear Energy Agency and other expert groups no longer see the principle of active forgetting as a serious and viable solution. So that's why the key information file was developed and designed. And it's based on these kind of different actors, and I won't go through all of this, but these are the different kind of archival networks. The idea that the key information file should be the most durable form of archive, so it should be very durable. It should be printed on paper it's made to last across millennia, or at least across centuries, I should say. It should be the most accessible, so it should be something that's accessible to people according to different kind of media technologies and cultures. And it should be the least detailed, so it should be just the most important, essential information that would allow someone to find more information about a nuclear waste repository if they needed to. And I should say that the key information file we wrote was drew slightly on an earlier draft in 2016 by the Swedish nuclear fuel and waste management company, SKB. Although we were brought in, and particularly myself and Anna brought in to provide different input and perspectives on this, and to provide different techniques and knowledge. So this is the key information file that we've devised, and this is the current cover. I should say that the document is fully written and drafted, and we're at the printing stage. I should say, even though I feel like it's completely finished, as we're printing it, we're discovering new things that we'd like to amend and fix to ensure that the key information file is durable, but also accessible, which is obviously a big challenge. It's a really unique kind of document that's really like nothing else I've ever come across before. So, of course, even in the printing of this document, we are faced with lots of different questions about the binding and the kind of paper and the acids in the paper that we're using. So we're consulting lots of different experts about how best to do this. But this is what it currently looks like. And I'll be sure to send around the final version to you once it's ready this year. And really it builds on lots of different kind of existing information. So the key information file is written by myself and Anna Storm. It's alongside France. It's the first one written internationally. So France and their group Andra, which is equivalent to SKB, have written a key information file as well, although it's slightly different in format. And it focuses on really specifically the Swedish geological repository for high-level nuclear waste. So it's not an international document about all repositories. It's just really focusing on the Swedish case. And this repository, of course, is not yet fully constructed, but it's planned to be constructed and finished by the end of the century. And inside the document, you can find crucial information that future readers need in the event of information lost. There's a real emphasis on clarity of expression. So we really wanted to make sure the document would be something that could be understandable by a non-expert reader. And so in a way, the technical information, the previous draft we were given was far too filled with technical data and lots of different different equations for calculating radioactive decay through time, things that a non-expert reader wouldn't necessarily understand and actually wouldn't be able to use. So we had to spend a lot of time negotiating the removal of a lot of this technical information and really ensuring just the most critical and clinical information was left over. And this is the kind of content that you can see. There are kind of three main parts. This summary, which is probably the most important part, the idea that actually in the first few pages you could see so much of the most important information straight away communicated very literally. We also thought the cover was so important. This is the main cover here, so you can see that we actually drew on the idea of things like the airline safety manual you get when you're sat on an aeroplane, which is a good example of actually using pictograms and images to convey quite technical information to a non-expert about how they should act and behave in the event of some kind of safety problem on the airline, including a crash. So this idea of using kind of human figures this kind of amorphous human figures. And this idea of share, imagine, renew was one concept we came up with, the idea that, or what we call shire, the shire method of share, imagine, renew, that somebody should share the document immediately, imagine new ways of communicating the information inside the document, and also the reader should actively seek to renew the information to make sure the information is up to date and is kept relevant in society. So the information inside here, this is actually the KBS3 method. So this is how the nuclear waste is buried, the pellets on the left, and this kind of copper canister here. You can see the copper canister here, sorry, and this is the fuel rod which goes inside of the copper canister and is buried underground. And we used a lot of the technical imagery we were given from SKB, and we tried to adapt it to make sure that it really appeared, understandable to a non-expert. That this is kind of very technical materials, very technical machinery inside of the ground, but it really relates back to this very central idea and problem of this is dangerous. It causes death to all organic life, and therefore the utmost care and caution should be taken in how you're exposed to this, and to ensuring that it doesn't get contaminated in the land and in the water or in the air. One of the ideas that's premised in the key information file is that in the future we should trust the reader to have some kind of to have good judgment about what to do with his information. So we're not trying to give any kind of value judgments, but to really just give the kind of most kind of very literal and kind of direct and obvious interpretation of this, without necessarily making it too much about how someone should act or should think or should feel. So the cover itself aims at being performative, like an airline safety manual. It should immediately convey, without reading anything, something about what this text is about, and should be presented in a style that's open to a wide non-expert audience. And just one last thing I wanted to mention, actually, before I go to the conclusion, it's just this idea that, we encountered lots of different challenges in writing this document. One of the things we wanted to introduce quite late on, because in a way we were battling with this idea of actually how do you create a document that can be read by non-experts, and read in a kind of very simple way that's not too technical, but you also don't want to infantilize people or treat them like they're not, to treat people like they're children. So we actually developed a different idea on the cover that I wanted to mention. You can see in this version here, these kind of symbols, at the top of this page, but also at the bottom here. So much of the document is about trying to make things very clear, to try and make very complex ideas very simple and easy to understand. And then right at the end, we decided to do the exact opposite of that. And the opposite is that we created a cipher. So we created this set of symbols that need to be deciphered to be understood. So there's a message that's conveyed through these symbols here that the reader has to try and decode using a key that's in the back of the document. And the idea that they can actually decode the message using this cipher themselves that isn't very easy to read otherwise. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to create an element of intrigue, an element of playfulness in the document, to give the reader a reason to look for this document, a reason to keep it, and a reason to return to the key information file. Because otherwise, if it is just a kind of simple document full of technical information like this, it's very likely that this document would be forgotten and its contents would be no longer relevant or not kept up to date. So much about this is about ensuring that the information inside is kept relevant, that people are aware of the document, and also that its contents are updated and kept safe. And that's really, so much more I could talk to you about this document, quite obviously invested and interested in it, and I obviously would like to in the second half, but just to kind of give you a few conclusions to end here. Oh, maybe this is slightly cut off. I wonder why that is. That's strange. Let me just see if I can. Oops. That's interesting. Okay. So just the final slide here. So the KIF is just one method of nuclear memory communication, and clearly there's lots of others. I mean, actually, we didn't come up with the concept ourselves, and there are different kind of limitations to the concept, but one of the strengths is that it's internationally recognized. Different countries trying to write their own key information files. So countries that are producing nuclear waste at the moment, and in nuclear energy producing countries, except at the moment for Russia, have definitely been involved with the process of how the key information file could be devised and what should go into it. So it's an international effort, and one that is ongoing, and one that hopefully will produce new results in the coming years. There's loads of challenges that I could have talked to you about in another slide. Everything from how it's updated, so how many years should go by before the document is updated, and things like that. So actually, what is the most suitable media for a key information file? We'll be printing ours in archival paper, which is meant to last for a long time. It'll be stored at the nuclear waste repository. So at the entrance to the repository, you'll find a version of the key information file. It'll also be stored in the Swedish National Archives, which is where important documents are kept. But also, this obviously needs to be online, because otherwise it's not very accessible. Some of the experts we've spoken with say that we should do things like put it into ceramics, because ceramic plates have this amazing ability to survive through centuries, and can be think about Roman ceramic plates, and actually thinking about their burial in the soil and earth, they can be retrieved and put back together even if they're broken. So one of the things we will do is print it in ceramic and put it inside of this Memory of Mankind, which is a project in Austria for storing information through millennia. But there's even then there's lots of challenges, including things like digital archives are important, but also very vulnerable. And some people have theorized that we'll be going through a lot of information loss in this century because of how reliant we are on digital archives that actually could easily be destroyed and lost. Part of the key information file, the premise is that it should be a living document. And what that means is it should be updated by subsequent generations. So it's really important, we think, to ensure that children and young people are involved with the key information file in Sweden, because then they not just are aware of it, but also could actively participate in how it's reproduced. So we've done things like workshops in schools where we ask them to create their own images and warning signs for communicating into the future. We also think that the key information file could be brought into national school curriculums in Sweden to ensure people are aware of this document and this problem, and so in the future could do something to ensure that at least the memory of this idea is not forgotten, even if so much of its content may get lost or forgotten through time. And finally, nuclear memory clearly needs to draw on a range of methods if a message is going to be kept alive over 100 millennia. And by a range of methods, I really mean social sciences, humanities, and arts, really ensuring that we draw on the widest range of possible expertise so that we can involve different kinds of information transfer and not just be reliant on one kind that might be vulnerable to information loss. And that's it. So here's our project website if you'd like to follow up, which I'll leave up so you can scan the QR code if you'd like to have a look at what we've been doing. And there's some references here that I drew on through the talk. So thank you. Thanks very much.